Good morning, guys. So today I am finally harvesting this hydroponics tower. Not finally harvesting, is like I'm glad it's going away because this thing has been awesome. But I am just very excited to get the actual garden going for spring. And putting this away, having it off my plate is one of those tasks. So today I'll be doing this massive harvest and a review of the Hydroponics hydroponic tower system, which I have right here. So first things first, I'm gonna be shutting off the pump to this tower because it's a little loud in here, which I'll be going over in my review. But after I shut off the pump, I'll go over the things that I grew and why I grew the things that I did over the winter in my tower. And then we'll do the harvest, which is going to be huge. And then I'll go over my review of the Hydroponics system and things I would change next year or keep the same, and my general thoughts on how this worked for me my first season of using this hydroponics grow tower. It's a jungle in here. It's so quiet in here. This has been running for months and it's like a part of my life now. Okay, so I'm gonna pull this out from the wall a little bit because there are tons of plants on the other side that I still need to show you. And it's doable by yourself. It's not that heavy. There's just obviously water at the bottom of this tower that I don't want spilling out while I pull it. So I grew several things in my hydroponics grow tower over the winter. But one thing that they all had in common were they were basically greens and herbs. I did not grow any flowering herbs or plants or anything that's fruiting like tomatoes or peppers. I just grew greens and herbs, and I'll get to that in a second. But what I currently have growing right now are arugula, mustard, parsley, basil, various types of lettuces. I have multiple in here. Culinary sage, kale, and summer savory. Now the reason I grew only greens in my hydroponics tower this season was because this is my first time with hydroponics. I know a ton about growing plants outside, in the ground, in pots, etc., etc. But for hydroponics, where you are required to provide 100% of this plant's nutrients, this was a learning experience for me. And when it comes to growing plants for their green leafy material versus growing them for their fruits, there are wildly different nutrient requirements needed at each stage of that plant's life. So first and foremost, I wouldn't have been able to grow greens and grow fruiting plants at the same time without a ton of knowledge, very specific harvesting dates, and knowing a lot about hydroponics that I don't know yet. Because the nutrients required for plants to fruit is very different for plants to grow greens. And if I had thrown fruiting nutrients in here, then all of my greens would have bolted because they think it's time to flower. It's a whole thing. So to make it easier on myself this growing season, I just did green leafy herbs and general winter greens in my hydroponics tower. That way I can maintain the same nutrients for all of the plants in my tower at one time. Now, of course, in the future, as I learn this more and more, I am very excited to see what I could possibly grow in this tower. But so far, this first season with this tower has been a massive success, and I harvested greens and honestly way too many herbs all winter long during the season when I don't get to grow a lot outside. Now, for some strange reason, despite the nutrient requirements and all of my plants doing well, my mustard still bolted. I mean, look at this massive flower stalk up here. And then there's another one right here. And this is Mizuna mustard. And I'm not quite sure why the mustard flowered, and it's only a couple of them. I did not change my nutrient inputs in these last couple weeks, but the one thing that has changed was the heat in this room, possibly because it is springtime here in the desert and this room is very warm. I've also been keeping it pretty warm, like keeping the door closed and letting this sunlight from the south wall heat up the room because it helps my seedlings for the garden to germinate. So maybe it was the heat. Like I said, I'm not quite sure. It still tastes good and it is spicy. Goodness, this mustard variety that I planted is so spicy. It almost tastes like wasabi, and it's very good in tacos, which is what I used it for. I'm not a big wasabi fan, but it has a great spice to like just a little sprinkle of it. Anyway, so let me grab some things to harvest all of this. I have no idea what I'm gonna do with this, guys. This will be a whole separate video of what on earth I am doing with everything I harvest today. But let's get it out of here. Okay, so I've got 3 stainless steel bowls and some water. And I think I'm going to put all the herbs in a bowl together and all of the lettuces in another bowl. I don't know if it's gonna be enough. I just wanna keep the roots moist until I figure out what I'm gonna be doing with these guys. Because I found that with hydroponics plants, because they're so accustomed, they grew up and live in water. If they dry out, man, it's like they just keel over. So keeping them moist, they're actually very good for several days on the counter in just a glass of water. So sometimes I'll come over here, pull up a lettuce, and instead of cutting it up and put it in the fridge, I just put it on the counter in a jar of water and it stays fresh and I can pick from it for days. Which seems silly because I could just easily come back here and pick from it. But it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. If I have it on the counter, then I will use it. So I think we'll start off with the sage and the herbs. But this is super easy, so sometimes you can just come back here and harvest what you want. Oh, it smells so good. But if you want the whole plant, all you have to do is pull it out. Look at this guy. So this one has been growing for a very long time. This is one of the original sage plants I put in this tower. And you can tell my original plants because of the length of their roots. Half these roots are just dangling in the reservoir water at the bottom. And then over time, as I've harvested various lettuces and everything, I'll just seed new plants and then fill them into the empty spots. And those roots are gonna be shorter. But this guy has been alive all winter. And I have harvested tons of sage off of him. So he's just gonna go in here, container and all, with some water. So when they get kind of big, it can be a little difficult to pull them out because their roots are just everywhere inside this tower. Let me show you. This is the sage I'm trying to pull out, and he has roots everywhere. Ah! Oh, got him. Here we go. Sheesh. My largest bowl is already full of parsley and sage. So I think we're gonna need another bowl. 5. I need another one. All right, last one, guys. It's all gotta fit. My summer savory is the smallest thing I have in here. They're little dinky little herbs. Ta-da! This is the last of it. And this is my entire garden harvest. I have so much mustard and sage and goodness. I have no idea what I'm gonna do with all of this parsley. I use a ton of spices and herbs while I'm cooking. I'm really big on flavor. Have a heavy hand, so they say. But I managed to grow mostly herbs that I don't ever use in cooking, which is hilarious. But I've dried a lot of sage. I've dried some parsley. Although parsley doesn't dehydrate as well, it's better freeze-dried. But I guess we're gonna have to come up with new ways to use these. So now on to the tower review. So I have some plants in here that did not make it. This lettuce looks abysmal. That's going to the chickens. This arugula, I believe that is. Yeah, that looks like arugula. Also did not make it. This is basil, did not make it. And this is holy basil, which I almost don't want to pull out. I seeded several holy basils in this tower because I wanted to see how it would do. My Genovese basil did great, but this is my only holy basil that came up. And now I'm about to kill him. So for this hydroponics tower, in terms of functionality, it performed beautifully. It comes with a pump and all the cordage and basically everything necessary besides the lights to make this work. So that is awesome. Granted, it is pretty expensive. I believe it's about $500 on Amazon, but I received it as a gift from Chase for my birthday last year. So I'm not really sure the going rate right now, but I will put a link down below, at least to Amazon where I can find it. So it is pricey. But it's all inclusive. It comes with everything besides the lights that you need, and nothing failed on me. The pump works fine. You guys can see this leakage right here. Despite looking like it leaks all over the place, it actually does not, unless you have a plant that may be too heavy. Like I had a lot of kale that just was huge. The kale got very big and would stand up. And then these tiny little cups, they don't work well with very heavy plants. So as that kale grew, this would start to come up because the weight of the plant was pushing it down. And once the weight of the plant would start to push this cup downward, there would be small little drips. It's super easy to maintain though. I mean, if you start seeing a couple drops of water on the ground, just find the plant that's directly above it, either push it back in or you have to harvest it immediately. It's a real easy fix. But all in all, I had really great success with the functionality of this product. It performed beautifully straight out of the box for me the entire season, and there's really no learning curve. If you have lights and water and nutrients, really the only learning curve is hydroponics itself and getting the nutrients right. And I'm not going to go into that because first off, I don't feel qualified to speak on it. I'm learning myself, although I do have a general knowledge of plant nutrients. There are plenty more channels out there that delve into hydroponics very specifically that know way more than I do. So I'm not going to speak to the nutrient aspect of this. I'll show you guys what I used, and obviously it worked for me. It's really cheap. It's run-of-the-mill basic nutrient stuff that you can get at any hydroponic store or online. But as for specifics, I'm really not going to go into that. I just don't want to lead you astray. Now bear with me because this place is a mess right now. But basically how this works, I have it on a timer for the lights, but the pump is hooked up separately to the wall because you want the pump running constantly once these plants get large enough. The reason for that is obviously hydroponic plants receive their nutrients from water. Now when the plants are small, the roots will stay in these little cups, and these cups will fill up with water and they'll be fine. So at the beginning when I had barely seeded these plants and they were just baby seedlings and I put them in here, Their roots were essentially always submerged because they were in those little cups of water. But once they get long enough to start trailing over the sides and down, you need this pump running 24/7 to make sure these roots stay moist. And although this pump was good and I never had any problems with it, it never got clogged, it's not the quietest. And I suppose you could buy a better pump online and then work in your tubing and everything like that after the fact, but honestly, I wasn't gonna spend any more money on it. It came with a pump, why not use it? So it's tolerable. It definitely makes the house kind of sound like there's a rain trickle somewhere in the house at all times. But when the water gets too low, you can really hear the pump and it's just a permeating noise. I am in a bedroom right now. I'm currently in Vivian's bedroom. Now, this would not be in here if the kids lived with us full time. Chase and his ex-wife co-parent. So it's not that big of a problem. Vivian doesn't mind the noise or the lights. She's only here every other weekend and sometimes during the weekdays. But if this were in a bedroom 100% full time, I could see where the noise may be a problem. As well as the lights. It is so bright in here, but you have to take that with a caveat because I also have my grow shelf in here. So there's just a ton of artificial light in this room. And with the amount of lights needed to cover all sides of this circular tower, it can be a little overwhelming. Obviously, if you start indoor plants or grow indoor plants, you know that plants need the same 12 hours of light that the sun is outside. So these lights and that pump are on 12 hours. Well, the pump is on 24 hours a day and the lights are on 12. So it can be a little overwhelming if this is in a bedroom. But if you have a spare room in your house where you could set this up, it would be golden. You could just run this constantly, have the lights going whenever you want. Maybe even if you had it in a garage so you wouldn't ever hear the noise. I think this is a great option. Now for the cleanliness. It's pretty good. It leaves a little to be desired, but not much. All of the staining that you see, this never actually made it down to the ground. So obviously this is all plastic. These parts just snap into each other when you get it in the mail. And plastic on plastic, it's not waterproof. There is going to be leakage, but if you can see right here, it just runs down into the next cup. And this runs down into the next seam, into the next cup. And here the bottom is on a recess. So even if it runs down, this will run directly into the reservoir and not down onto the ground. The only issue I had coming in here when there was water on the ground was if, like I said before, one of these plants started falling out and then the leaves were dripping the water down onto the ground, which isn't much of a problem. You should be keeping up on your plants regardless. So you'll have to monitor it daily, which is necessary anyways because you have to water it daily. I would definitely say if you only have a carpeted area to maybe put some sort of plastic sheeting underneath just in case, or just put it on tile. It's absolutely doable with carpet, but there are accidental spills all the time. You can't control how fast the plants grow. Obviously, when I was pulling all of these plants out, they were dripping water. This is a hydroponics system. There's water. So just be mindful. It's doable on a carpeted system. I had no leaks other than plants falling out, but it is something to consider if that's the only kind of space you have. Now for water usage. I put about, once these plants were full grown, so, well, let me preface this. I grew this over the winter and we are now in the middle of March, towards the end of March into the spring, where this room is a lot warmer than it was in December and January. So at the beginning I was putting in maybe a gallon a day, and now I'm putting in close to 2 gallons a day. That has a lot of factors. I'm sure it's because these plants were full grown, so they were obviously consuming a lot more water and nutrients, but also the heat in this room has increased. So there will be more evapotranspiration from these plants and just evaporation from the unit itself because of the heat in the room. But 2 gallons a day is not that big a deal. I just fill up 2 jugs, put nutrients in them if I need to, pour it in the top, and I'm done. So it's very simple and manageable, and honestly for growing, this has 48 slots in it. For growing 48 plants to full size and having the massive harvest that I just had, it's absolutely worth it. So the nutrients that I used were some of the most basic, well-known hydroponics nutrients you can buy. They're by General Hydroponics, and they have a set of 3 that you're gonna need to get started. Flora Grow, Flora Bloom, and Flora Micro. And what's super great about these is they tell you exactly how much you'll need for each phase of growth in the plant's life. So for cuttings and seedlings, we're going to use 1/4 teaspoon per gallon of Grow, Micro, and Bloom. And that information is present on all of these. And then I also have pH down, which is what I use the most. I never actually used the pH up, which I can't even find it in here. But another thing you need to take into account with hydroponics beyond nutrients is the pH. Now I have pretty hard water here. I use well water. I live in the desert. It's very alkaline. So mostly what I used was pH down. I never once used a pH up. You'll also need pH test strips or a pH meter. I did purchase a quite expensive pH meter, but I'm also using that for several different purposes besides just hydroponics. I was pretty worried about pH at the beginning when I first started this project, but quickly learned that the plants will grow regardless. They may wilt a little, their leaves may burn. The pH has to be in the correct range for the plants to be able to absorb nutrients, but that range is rather large. And a pH strip, if that's all you've got, will absolutely do the job. Please don't spend tons of money on an expensive pH meter. It's really not necessary, I promise. In fact, like for the last 2 months, I didn't even use it. I just used the strips and would toss in 1/4 teaspoon of pH down when I felt that the plants needed it. Now, plants mostly grow best in a pH range of like 6 to 7 or 6.5 to 7.5. Each individual plant that you grow, you can Google it, you can look it up and see what pH is best for that plant. So you obviously don't want to put several plants in this tower that have vastly different pH ranges they like to live in. Obviously you're not going to grow blueberries in here, but one example would be blueberries. They like very, very acidic soil, like in the 5.5 range. You're not going to throw these in there when the rest of your plants like 7.0, because it's just not physically possible for you to separate out the pH for each plant all in the same tower. And it's kind of like how I grew only green leafy vegetables and herbs in my tower this time, because I didn't want to send all of my green leafy herbs to flower if I were growing something that required flower to fruit. So now let's move on to things I've learned. So when I first started this hydroponics project, I didn't really know how often I needed to give nutrients to these plants. At first, when I was putting my gallon of water in a day, I was putting nutrients in every single day, and that was a big mistake. You have to remember that the water inside this tower is circulating constantly, and not all of the nutrients will be taken up. So just because I'm putting in a gallon of water with nutrients a day does not mean that those plants will go through all those nutrients in one day. And what I found when I was doing that for a couple weeks was that a lot of my plants were burning. And basically burning would just be the severe browning or deadening of the leaf tips, followed by it just works its way inward to the entire plant. So I cut back. I stopped putting in nutrients for quite a while, actually, like a whole week, and I just put straight water in. I kept the pH maintained because the pH is required for the plants to be able to absorb the nutrients. But I just stopped putting nutrients in for a while and they all bounced back. So I don't have a specific formula for you guys, like how often they need nutrients, but just monitor your plants and see how they're responding to the amount that how often you're putting the nutrients in. Another thing I learned was you do not want to put very, very small seedlings in these little cups. So how you germinate these is how I did it, is in rock wool, which is an inorganic, basically spun rock material that you just place the seed in, germinate it, and then once it's a little seedling, you can stick this cup into the tower and off it goes. The problem is when these seedlings are too small, like say this guy's dead, so I'm just gonna cut him off. If this guy was this small of a seedling and I put this cup in the hydroponics tower, the water spurting would constantly be wetting the top of the seedling. And if you're familiar with indoor seed starting, if you keep a seedling too wet, they can do what's called damping off, which is a fancy way of saying they dead. They will just die. So you want to wait until the seedlings get a little bit bigger and they're able to keep their head out of this area of the cup, because the water is constantly squirting down right here inside of the cup. So if the seedlings are too small, they're going to be constantly getting wet and they're gonna die. So you need to wait until they're grown out a bit to put this cup in the tower. I had several seedlings die off this way before I figured out what was going on, but it's a real easy fix. All y'all have to do is when you start your seedlings in the rock wool or a sponge or however you're starting your hydroponic seedlings, just wait a little bit longer. Wait till they're, 2-3 inches tall and then stick them in here, because the only thing you want to be moist all the time are the roots. You do not want the leaves moist. First off, that's gonna drip down onto your floor. And then secondly, well, they might just die. And here are some good examples of that. This guy just got continually pelted. This, if you touch this, it's like gross. It's just all moist and slimy. This guy too. You can even see here that there's a bit of mold right here, and that's just from it constantly being wet over and over again. And I didn't pull this guy out. I didn't even see him, honestly, with all the other plants that were in here. So that's a really important tip, is just make sure you grow your seedlings out a little bit more before you put them into the tower. Now I did have some plants die off. I don't know why. I'm not too worried about it. Honestly, it was like 2 out of 48 plants that would just keel over and die. Plants die all the time outside too, and you're not always gonna know why. Overall, this entire tower was a giant success, so it may just have been a bad plant, may have not gotten water for a certain period of time if the other plants were taking it. But 1 or 2 plants dying in here, I'm not that worried about it. The only one huge qualm I had with this tower was the delivery method of the water, and I'm not even certain it's not the tower's fault. I suppose there could be a better way. I haven't thought of one, so I can't really complain. But here's where the water comes out. So the reservoir and the pump are down there. The water travels up here through this tube and into this PVC grid, where the water then comes out at each of these holes and squirts into their respective columns all the way down, and the cycle begins over again. But a huge issue I found were with these tiny little holes in the PVC getting clogged up. So here I've turned the pump back on, and as you can see, the water's coming out at almost every hole. But oftentimes something like this would happen where this hole gets clogged up. And it's honestly like a really easy fix. You could take like the tip of a pen or some sort of sharp small object you have and poke it in there. Maybe you work it around. There we go. And it's not really something I can stop. I have 4 dogs, 4 cats. There's obviously dust in the house. So it's just extra stuff that's trying to come through a very small hole from the water reservoir. The only issue is that if you don't check that often enough, you could have a whole column of plants without water for a long period of time. So that's really the only main issue I had with this system, but otherwise, it's amazing. Look at all my plants. Look at everything I grew over the winter. in a season when I can't really garden outside. I think that's fantastic. So all in all, I really do recommend this system. I don't recommend the price. It's super expensive. I didn't have to buy it, thankfully, but it's pretty expensive for a hydroponics tower. And I know I have seen like DIY versions on YouTube with PVC and some cool stuff. It's super cheap. It's totally doable DIY, guys. Obviously, I am not affiliated with Hydroponics system. I just think it's a cool product, and it grew me tons of food over the winter. So I can honestly, personally recommend it, but there are cheaper ways to do hydroponics. So just in general, I want to encourage you guys that this is a very quick way to get a large amount of food in a small space. Either if you don't have a large garden outside, or you're unable to grow, say you live in a small apartment, this is great. And then even if you do have a large garden like I do, and you just can't grow over the winter because it's too cold, well, I got my little green thumb addiction in over the winter because of this tower. So I hope that was helpful. I don't know, I know I've gotten some questions online about this tower, and I don't know if I answered them all, but if I didn't, please, please, please leave me questions and comments down below. Thank you guys for joining me today. Till the next one.